Will the government review all penalty fines imposed on families travelling for childcare purposes during lockdown? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Martin. That's a very good question. And we do understand the impact and the need for making sure that children get adequate childcare. That is one of the significant concerns that we've had all the way through this. And so I think, especially coming from a man of the cloth, I think that is perfectly reasonable to take away that question. I'll have to talk to my Treasury colleagues before I can answer it in full. And we'll look at it, and if we can get your details, we'll make sure that we write to you with a full answer and make an announcement from this podium. I think we can make that commitment.
Nearly 40 of your colleagues believe that the Prime Minister's top advisor let the country down and want him gone. Given that you stood there at that lectern and told people the guidelines weren't advice, they were instructions, do you feel that way, or at least see why your colleagues do too?
Well, thank you, Laura. On this question, Mr. Cummings has set out all of the details in quite extensive detail yesterday, and then invited questions on it. My view is that what he did was within the guidelines. I can understand why reasonable people can take a different view, but my judgment, which is the same as the Prime Minister's judgment, is that what Mr. Cummings did was within the guidelines. After all, the guidelines allow for exceptional circumstances, particularly with regard to childcare. And if you are, and we've stated before, that if you're unable to look after a small child, that is an exceptional circumstance. So I think that within the guidelines, Mr. Cummings acted, and the most important thing is that we can get on and deal with the other issues, for instance, those that I've talked about today on PPE and on treatments.
But, Health Secretary, do you admit that it's doing damage to the government's credibility and maybe undermining the message? I mean, you've just there at that lectern said, after a question from a member of the public, that you might review some of the fines that have been given to people if they were travelling for reasons to do with their children. This is making a difference, is it not, to what you're trying to do in government?
No, I actually think that it's incredibly important that people keep their resolve. As we can see from the falling number of deaths, the falling number of hospital admissions, and as we stand up the increased test and trace capability, I think it's incredibly important that as a nation we keep our resolve. Everybody has a part to play in this, and everybody needs to act in a way that's responsible both for them and for their community. I think that I do think that's important, and I think it's important that we all stick at it. Thanks very much. Robert Peston from ITV.
Secretary of State, you and your wife tested positive for COVID-19. You have 3 young children, but you chose to stay at home in London. What is the relevant difference between you and Dominic Cummings?
The relevant difference, Robert, is that we had childcare readily available at home and Mr. Cummings didn't. Thanks very much. Ben Kentish from LBC.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Health Secretary, 71% of people disagree with you and the Prime Minister. They think Dominic Cummings did break the rules, and because of that, confidence in the government has plummeted 20 points in just 4 days. Given how important that confidence is to pretty much everything you're trying to do, from maintaining social distancing to reopening the economy and getting people back to work, and the track and trace system that you're introducing next week, how much does that apparent loss of people's confidence worry you? And what do you say to those who say simply, that means you are risking people's health and the health of the economy, all people think, to save one number 10 advisor? What would you say to them?
Well, of course, I understand the anger that some people feel, and I regret the anger that some people feel. And Mr. Cummings himself said that with hindsight, he should have got all these the facts out earlier. What I say is that it's incredibly important that as a country we focus on what we need to do now. And I've said this repeatedly through this crisis. You've got to wake up every day and work out what is the best thing to do next, and making sure, for instance, that we have the PPE available and that we protect people on the front line, making progress on these treatments, as I talked about. These are the critical next steps that we need to take, along with, as you said, making changes to the social distancing rules to allow people to get back to doing some of the things that they love. If you look at the earlier question from Ellie from Kent, it's all about how do we get back to a position where I can see my loved ones. These are the sorts of things that the country is yearning for, and I'm not underplaying the importance of the debate that there's been, and as I've said, entirely reasonable that reasonable people can disagree with the over what happened over the description of what happened over the weekend. But I'm here to focus on and really drive forward all of the other important things that we need to do as well. Thanks very much. Seb Payne from the FT.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hancock. Mr. Hancock, as we've just heard, according to a poll conducted today after that press conference, 71% of the public said after hearing Mr. Cummings' versions of the events, they believe his drive to Durham broke the lockdown rules. You've just said that it didn't. Are you saying that 71% of the British public misunderstood those rules? And if so, does that mean you as a government have failed drafting them? And also, if you don't mind me asking, would you now advise Britons to use that discretion when interpreting the rules, or is that discretion just for people who work in Downing Street? Thank you.
As I've said, it is incredibly important that people follow the guidelines. I was actually standing at this podium when the DCMO set out that clearly, as she put it, clearly if you have adults who are unable to look after a small child, that is an exceptional circumstance. And the guidelines were drafted with exceptional circumstances in mind. There were other exceptional circumstances that are set out that don't apply in this case, but describe some of the other exceptional circumstances that people face. Therefore, I think it is reasonable to conclude that the description of events that Mr. Cummings put out yesterday was within the guidelines. But I also, as I've said in answer, I think, to the first question, I do think that I understand that reasonable people will disagree with that, and of course I understand some of the anger that boiled up over the weekend.